Thank you very much, Jeff. So, several people here have assumed this will be a talk about the minimum wage. It is not a talk about the minimum wage. The full title is Less Than the Minimum, Rethinking the Night Watchman State. All right, so how many people here are familiar with the term the minimal state? Yes, all right, and you may have also heard the term night watchman state, which as far as I know is a 19th century term, giving a picture, really giving a metaphor for the state. So what does the night watchman in a factory do? Well, first of all, he's just one guy. So it's not a very big deal. It's just one guy alone in a factory. And what does he do there is he just sits there and makes sure that nobody robs the place or burns it down. Right? So this in the 19th century was a picture that many people had of what government could do, which is it would just be this little guy, be like one guy in a room somewhere, where if something happened, you'd call him up, and he'd say, okay, well, we'll take care of that. Okay, now over time, the idea of what the minimal or night watchman state has been developed, and generally, when people make a list of what is included in the minimal or night watchman state, it includes three basic things. Okay, so the first of all of these is police. Okay, so people think of this as being very basic to what government does. Second is courts. And finally, the last is rule formation, right? Because courts don't simply exist, they are there to enforce rules. Okay, now one other thing that's often also added here, but what I'm not going to talk about, is national defense. One way to think about it is that you could certainly have a minimal state without national defense if it were a world government. Okay, so if you imagine having a world night watchman state where there's one government on Earth that does these three things, that's it, and it has no national defense because there's no one else on Earth to fight, so it is entirely unnecessary, so that's pretty conceivable. Okay. Now, there are some libertarians who have made the argument that all of these things could be fully privatized. Right? So that is a very radical argument, as you may know. Right? Or it may not seem radical to you anymore, I don't know. But to most people, if you were to go and say, we need to privatize all the police right now, today, before it's too late, people would think that was kind of crazy. Right? So that seems like a radical idea. And of course, when you go and present a very radical idea to someone who's never heard of it, they naturally will dismiss you as crazy. Anyone ever been dismissed as crazy? Yeah. All right. Yes, everyone thought we were crazy at some point. So, of course, one thing you can do is continue arguing the most radical case, but I find that it's very often helpful just to meet people exactly where they are and to see what precisely it is that they actually are sure is crazy and what, in fact, might not be all that crazy even from where they're standing. Okay, so, and in general, I have found this to be the best argumentative strategy, which is step one, find some area where you agree with the person that you're talking to. It's called finding common ground. Right? What would you accept? Then step two is to see if you can get anywhere from where the person already is. And very often, I think you can, actually. Okay, so I personally, when I first began studying economics, all of this was new to me. But the things that I read were written in such a way that I say, okay, well, considering what you already think and what you already know, or do your views actually make sense, or could we actually change them? Okay. So before considering any claim about privatizing all the police or all the courts or rule formation or anything along those lines, it's worth considering whether a government monopoly in these industries is necessary or desirable. Because again, usually when people describe the minimal or night watchman state, they say, well, government will do these three things, and only government gets to do these three things. And so people often say, well, government has to have a monopoly over police, monopoly over courts, monopoly over rule formation. Because if government didn't have a monopoly over these things, it would be anarchy. Right? It would be a disaster, it would be very dangerous, so on. Okay? So anyway, before considering the case for full privatization, it's just worth considering whether it's possible to have partial privatization. Right? Is a monopoly actually necessary or not? Okay? All right, so worth considering whether a monopoly is necessary or desirable. Now, before we go on, what I'm doing today is going to be an example of what Tim Harford, the undercover economist, how many people know Tim Harford, the undercover economist, what he calls keyhole surgery or keyhole economics. The idea comes from a certain kind of surgery called keyhole surgery, where you see a person has a problem, and the doctor says, all right, I'm going to make the smallest incision I need to in order to solve this problem and do the least invasive surgery necessary. because surgery is dangerous, so you don't want to do any more of it than you really need to. Okay, so in the case of surgery, this just means doing a very small medical intervention in order to get things back on track. But then Tim Harford suggested applying this idea to economic policy. And he said, well, why don't we think about keyhole economics, which is anytime someone is concerned about a market outcome, we try to figure out the smallest possible thing that could be done that would get the market working again. Right, so he talks about this for healthcare and in a number of other areas. But again, this is a mindset where you say, all right, look, right, I'm willing to listen to any problems that you might have with how the market's working, but even taking those problems for granted, rather than taking these arguments and saying that they justify whatever it is that we have, instead, why don't we step back and think about the smallest necessary thing to do in order to deal with this problem? Okay, so I came in towards the end of Ben Powell's lecture on immigration last night, but when I was blogging for the Economist blog about immigration restrictions, one of the main points that I made is that immigration restrictions are a much more invasive policy than is necessary to deal with most of the complaints. So for example, if your concern is that immigrants are going to go on welfare, what is something you could do other than say no immigrants can come into the country? Limit welfare. How about that? Saying that someone can't collect welfare is a lot less invasive than saying that they are not allowed into the country at all. Okay, for example. Or another one like if someone says, hey, look, these immigrants are hurting the incomes of low-skilled Americans. Well, if you really want to do something about that, there is a much cheaper way of doing it and a much more humane way than keeping immigrants out of the country. Okay, so, for example, if you really want to deal with that, you could say that immigrants can come here, but they have to pay a higher tax rate, and you use that money to compensate low-skilled Americans for their losses. I'm not saying this is a good idea. I'm saying this is keyhole surgery for dealing with the specific problem of harm to low-skilled Americans. Okay, so any questions about that? Happy about that? Okay. All right, so let's just start with the case of police. So what you mean by thinking about, so we have these government police here, but what functions of the police could easily be privatized? Now before you answer, I will say this. It is often when you're wondering about what's possible, it's often very helpful to take a look at what exists. Because if something exists, then it is definitely possible. Right, everyone familiar with this idea? All right, so yes, it is possible to run for a private company to run television, and it was possible even before there was cable TV, because someone came up with the idea of having commercials. Okay, so it's possible to do. Okay. Let's see. Last week when I was at Chicago, John Hosnow said that whenever he calls Tom Palmer, who works at Cato, Tom will often say, "Hold on, I'm doing something impossible right now. I'm watching TV." That wasn't provided for by the government, right? So, actually it is possible. That's the point. Right, that's the joke. Okay, so what police or police-like functions are already run by the market in part today?
Neighborhood patrol.
Neighborhood patrol, that's one. Yes? Maybe construction crews. Okay. Kind of. I mean, although of course they're given specific permission to go and do it in order to do the road work. Let's see. Anyone ever been to a mall? I've been to a mall. Anyone ever been to a mall? Yeah. There are these great big places with stores that sell stuff, and you can stay there for free all day if you want to, and no one ever asks you what you're there for. Well, of course, if you start causing trouble, you will be asked what you're there for, and you will be asked by mall security. What are you doing here? Why are you harassing paid customers? Again. All right, so mall security is an example, and if you take a look at the entire security guard industry around the United States, there's an amazing fact. In the United States, there are more security guards than police right now. Right, so this is not some crazy idea that you have to come to fee in order to hear about, saying we could have more than half the police privatized. More than half the police are already privatized. Right, we just don't think about it that way. But nevertheless, they are. And again, this is the kind of thing where if you just didn't have any, if security guards were illegal and then you suggested doing it, and someone said, well, what if security guards came to be more than half of all the police in the country? Then they would attack the existing police and overthrow them. Last time I checked, the mall security is not planning on marching to the local police station and having a shootout with them. I don't know. Maybe yes. Well, we can deal with that later. Possibly, but there are better ways of making the transition than a shootout at the OK Corral.